Perhaps both Solomon and Job do not reflect the consensus of all these 389 Old Testament references to spirit or ruach. Well, pretty much they do. Nowhere in any of these references to spirit, perhaps except for maybe one or two places, which are questionable places, spirit is a word that is never is it used to suggest that some form of spiritual subsistence to the body lives on as a conscious entity beyond death. We read again in Genesis 2 verse 7 that when God breathed this spirit into the nostrils of the dust that he had formed or shaped into a man, man became a living being, as my New International Version puts it. In the King James it says, man became a living soul rather than living being. And when people have seen the term soul or become a living soul, they have assumed that this is the part that lives on consciously beyond death. No, let's read it again. The combination of the dust and spirit results in life. It's somewhat unfortunate that the King James has translated the original language into living soul. It's a little bit misleading, and I think the NIV is more helpful in translating it, the combination of dust and spirit as a living being. Therefore, when the spirit is removed from the dust, the human ceases to be a living soul or living being. The term soul or being in my NIV is translated from the Hebrew word nephesh. This word is used some 755 times throughout the Old Testament. Although traditionally thought to be that which distinguished human beings from the animals, and the immortal bit that survives death, it is in fact the same word used of animals as living creatures, with no distinction. Where in Genesis chapter 1 verse 21 we read of the great creatures of the sea, the word creature is nephesh, as used exactly of humans. The word shows up again and again to describe animal creatures. For example, Genesis 2 verse 19, with Noah's flood, in chapter 9 of Genesis verse 10, verse 12, verse 15 and 16, and in many other places. Human beings are not distinguished from animals as having souls. All living creatures are defined as souls, although that's probably not entirely accurate. But all living creatures are defined as living creatures. In fact, to import the term soul is perhaps not an accurate way of trying to define the meaning of the Hebrew word nephesh. It's a little bit of a difficult word that can be used literally or figuratively in many different ways. The Hebrew Old Testament concept of being a living creature is quite different from what we have come to define as a soul and read onto the Old Testament out of our Western thought. It could be said, therefore, that the term soul that has been used in the King James in fact means a living, breathing creature combining both dust and spirit, as a bit of a generalization. However, this is a little too simplistic. The word nephesh is used in various contexts throughout the Old Testament in some 14 different ways. For example, in Genesis chapter 34 verse 3, it is used to point to an emotional attachment of the heart. Although used in some 14 different ways, as we've said, which makes things a little tricky, it is never once used in its 755 uses places in the Old Testament, as some sort of immortal subsistent phantom that is contained in a body and released at the point of death. In fact, the Old Testament speaks plainly against such a false notion. In Ezekiel chapter 18 verse 4 we read in the King James Version, "The soul that sins, it shall surely die." It's probably better translated, "The living creature that sins, it shall surely die." In Leviticus chapter 18 verse 29 we read that any soul or nephesh or living creature that defies God's command shall be cut off or put to death from the people. So souls, if that's the English word which we might favour to translate to from nephesh, souls or living creatures can be killed. Well, maybe then, if our tradition is so strong and we're not really agreeing with what I'm saying this morning, maybe neither spirit or soul is the words or terms that we should use to talk about some part that leaves the body and lives on consciously in some sort of an afterlife. Surely, we might argue, when a person dies, they go somewhere. They go to either heaven or hell in the form of something or some sort of indestructible personality, even if we don't use the word spirit or soul. Tradition is so powerful that we seem to reason or argue that something's got to survive consciously. We find it difficult to believe that our personality ceases, our consciousness ends in the grave.